Brussels, and I just have to say it's not only the most beautiful city of the world, but this is also the most visited city of the world by the urban planners from Gdańsk, I have to say. And I just have to say we are just going there a week from now, so I'm very much excited. And another great news is that the Gdańsk Development Office is going there in a group of 40 municipal planners in the fall. So we will be flooded with Polish planners in Lisbon pretty soon. And thank you very much for this, especially that you are very much underlining this spatial aspect of metropolitan planning. I think this is something which we very much forget about in Poland, that we have a kind of perception that metropolitan planning is just, managing fiscal policy or this kind of the thing, while of course it's important, but even more important is that in the end we all end up in the physical space, which also has its metropolitan dimension. And I think this is something which our regional planners still have to learn about. Okay? Well, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and now let me invite Mrs. Judith Reiser. She is representing Fondation Metropoli and also Cityscope Europe. And foremost, I think, she is representing International Society of City and Regional Planners. I'm very happy to have you here, Judith, despite all the problems with the rebooking and flying through the other end of the world to here. But you finally managed. Thank you very much. And the title of Judith's presentation is London Experiences with Metropolitan Planning and Management. And sorry for saying this in English, but I think it was easier in relation to both of your legs. So Judith, the floor is yours. Thank you. Where do you have this? This one, yeah? Yep, there you go. Okay, yeah, there we go.
So, thank you very much for having me, and I hope to make a contribution to your very interesting region, which I have visited many, many years ago during the dark ages of Poland, and so I'm very interested to find out what happened since then. So, with any further ado, I am not exactly only talking about London, because my interest, especially with the work I'm doing with the Fondation Metropoli, is really the big picture. And I think the kind of reflections we have had and still do might be of some use to what you're trying to do here in the kind of on the Baltic, in the whole bay, and the polycentric structure which you have and which you want to exploit and explore better. This picture, the background, is called Rome Less. It's a sort of very high-tech stuff where somebody has tried to find out how management maybe could look like in spatial terms when you do not have Rome, and what they mean, of course, is the Rome of the antiquity. So I think the urban growth and management is a question of scale. You are doing different things at different scales, and the very important thing, and which is the last paper has just in fact referred to, that Lisbon is doing, is to actually interact continuously between these various scales. Whether or not you have got them there, that's not that important actually, and I will come back onto that. But always to go back to the big picture, to have a proper dialectic with this, then that also helps you to break open the fiefdoms of interest, political or companies or people, whatever it is. It helps you, this dialectic helps you to shift the ground between the discussion partners. In fact, that is certainly our experience, and I will show you an example. So here are just 4 examples. The world scale, of course. On the bottom left is sort of Mediterranean realm, which you can look at as one kind of historic and real morphological area. The top right is the Isle of Dogs, where we now have our second financial centre in London. But this is from the times before the Big Bang, that is when the financial market was liberalised, and that the Greater London Council, which was then the citywide administration, had actually prepared 7 or so visions for that area, completely different, from new town to regeneration to make it all agricultural, whatever. Very interesting, actually, historic document, which, because in a way it was quite advanced and quite adventurous. At the bottom is Paris, of course, where you can see again, they want to think of, at the regional scale, you have a very clear boundary about Paris, then you have got Ile-de-France, and you have got Paris in the desert of France. So you have all these kind of scales to contend with all the time. Now, the mega connections, there is a history of that as well, and in some way it has started in the United States, what it has not. All the wisdoms in the UK comes from there anyway. But I mean, it was actually planners who had started to work in a rather non-planned country, and very disparate and all that, and very, very liberal from an economic point of view. So it was in a way quite interesting that they were starting to think at a really massive mega scale, from Boston to Washington. And it has actually real effects, because they have instated, for example, a high-speed railway network and things like that, which were absolutely un-American, when everything goes by road and everything goes by car. So and the cities are cooperating either functionally or on specific issues, or territorially, depending. And this is an extremely interesting experiment, which of course has been lasting for the last 30 years or something like that. And you can see the other regions which have started to cooperate in different ways, and they are, when you look at the statistics, the economic statistics, they are the most dynamic and the most rich regions of the whole of the United States. In Japan it's slightly different, because when you look at the very long island, you have got this belt between Tokyo and Fukuoka, and that's where the population is settled, and so very dense with a bullet train and all. Again, they also established connections a long time ago, and they concentrate all of their development there. I mean, not all, but I mean, a lot of it. So when you look at the pictures at the bottom, you can see the density and how it is very irregularly distributed. So in fact, what we're trying to do is to look at those pictures at the bottom and see how we actually don't go against the grain, but go with the grain. Say, where are these things, and how can we improve them, how can we harness them, how can we create dynamic economic development from them. So when you look at the same pictures about the metropolitanization of Europe, you can see the very uneven development of density and population location and so forth. So even there, I mean, when you try to situate Gdańsk, it's a sort of in a green periphery, and when you look at the centre, of course, it's red. That includes also our southeast of England up to Manchester. And so these connections, of course, there are different kind of perceptions about them, and I just chose a few examples. On the top left, this is a sort of ecological idea, which has been done by the alternative people, and said, well, these are the kind of natural morphological connections we have at a very large scale, actually. The bottom one is what Minsk, what wishful thinking, they see. Look, you always put yourself in the center, and then you have rings around you, wherever you are on the world, including the North Pole. So they did that and said, well, actually, really, what we need and what we will get is this red line that is linking them outwards. Interestingly enough, east-west, because usually in the EU we do the opposite, like you see the famous banana, which is on the other picture, which was basically actually proposed by a geographer, Brunet, and that wasn't to include Paris, it was to actually demonstrate that the French government in Paris was excluded of this development density, and henceforth it should really pay attention and change its strategy. So one tends to forget that this is the origin of it all. Now, that was a little picture which I have concocted a long time ago when the Goethe Institute asked me to curate a seminar when the wall came down in Europe, and say, well, let's look at divided cities. So Berlin was the obvious divided city, but we felt that London actually was also a divided city. And that gave the incentive to me to actually look at these big connections which we have. And you can see the ring on top, just to get one, and that is the Hanseaten connections, which are very historic, and to which, of course, Gdańsk belonged at the time, was an important partner of this which lasted for a very long time and created an awful lot of prosperity around the Baltic Sea and beyond. And you have where the blue dots are. This is what we studied with the Fondation Metropoli, which we called the Southern European diagonal, and I'll come back onto that also. So here are a few kind of groupings, and of course they are all basically mental and conceptual, and they come from Faloudi's work towards the ESDP. There are many more of those, but I just chose two, because on the right-hand side you already have the transformation from the banana into what now is the European Pentagon, which is sitting in the south, in the northwest. And that is where all the concentration is, and that is in their perception, the EU perception. So this is our only competitive, globally competitive region, so we have to actually continue to densify it and to concentrate all our economic basis in that. And we said, actually, not really. You can see that differently. So there are completely different ways of looking at different connections across Europe or Western Europe. So on the one hand, when we were working with Bilbao and the Basque country, so of course they took themselves in the center of the world and said, well, we belong to the Arctic arc, which is very important because their shipping connections for centuries and so on were connected, including to Lisbon. Actually, all this connection exists even with Ireland and so on. So this is another kind of coherent regional, mega-regional strategy, which is actually also polycentric and which has got centralities in various places and had cooperation, competition, all these things combined. So in the south you have what we worked at our north of the south, that means our European diagonal, which is this one. So we said, well, actually here is the Pentagon, and at the bottom the south has a lot of communalities if it starts to work together on what they have common assets and common problems. In fact, they could do very well. Besides, at that time, before the collapse of the banks, the south is growing twice as fast as the north. Of course, from a different starting level, one has to say. So this is a sort of symbolic explanation of our diagonal, which we did with students from the Penn University. And we went even further and said, in fact, you have to look at the historic connections with Iberia, with Latin America, with the whole Mediterranean connections, which are also very ancient, Roman times, Greek times, Ottoman times, you name it, they were there, the connection existed, also climatically, morphologically, historically, all that. And this is what I call the archaeology of spatial memory, and you can build on that, because it is there, it is very strong. And instead of just copying some kind of architectural fads and put them there like tower blocks and the highest is the best and so on, maybe there is another approach to regional and spatial development. So we started to work in one project which was EU funded with MEDOC, with these cities, and see what are their specificity, what are their assets, what are their weaknesses and so on, and how could they benefit from each other. That was in the time when, of course, Iberia was benefiting very much from its membership of the EU, especially from the TEN, from the transportation networks. And they especially in particular, Spain was very clever in attracting the money and had done a fantastic amount of investment in high-speed trains, in airport expansion, etc., etc. Portugal was a little bit on the edge and was a little bit slower, but and so it has actually lost out on some of it, but not all. But anyway, and then of course the other question was, well, where does it go, this diagonal in the other direction? Does it go up to Gdańsk, or does it go to Vienna and beyond? I mean, the old connection of the Habsburgs and Isabella of Spain or whatever, so we were thinking about all those kind of connections, which we found quite interesting occasionally. So this is part of our study, which we did in more detail. And in fact, the underlying map is designed and conceived and developed by a professor of the Politecnico di Milano, Fabio Casiroli. And what he did here, the green area, actually shows the impact of the new high-speed train connections along the south. And it's absolutely extraordinary. So he says, well, you know, up to 400 kilometers you would take the train it competes with air, and how much it actually was diffusing into the hinterland and raising the economic assets and the economic benefits for rather deprived and decentralized and peripheral areas. So that was an extremely interesting study he has done in great detail. And when we worked with him, we said, well, here are the cities, and of course, the first thing which the director of the Fondation did is went to go and see the mayors of all these cities. So we went to Milano, Marseille, Barcelona, Madrid, and Lisbon. And we worked, because without the mayors, or whoever it is who's in charge there, you cannot even do these conceptual works, then they become completely purely academic. And this is not what I'm in business for. I'm a practitioner, so I'm interested in some outcome at the end of all this exercise. So we were in cooperation with them, and they were quite interested, and that meant through us we were sort of catalysts for them to meet up, which they don't necessarily do, because they're somewhere in theory they're in competition with each other, or they do the city marketing and all that sort of stuff, and say, we want to show their angle. And they say, well, actually, together you're stronger, because then you can highlight your specificity and you can learn from each other. For example, Lisbon had its expo. It was very successful in transforming that and regenerating that part of Lisbon in the east, in the poor area. And Milano was just preparing its expo. So it had similar interests, really complete. There was a learning process which was very beneficial for actually both parties, because then the people in Lisbon, they created a development company which now is working for other cities, and Milano was quite interested in them. So it can work both ways. Now another little anecdote which I think might be relevant for your situation here. As you see, you have Madrid in the center of Spain and Barcelona in the east. And those are the two most important cities, most dynamic, richest and all that. But of course, they are really very competitive. And so they said, well, why should we, be the best and all that? So we went to see the mayoress of Valencia. And we went to see the mayor of Zaragoza. And Zaragoza just had a World Expo. So what do you do after that? So, this lull. They said, why don't we have to subdivide this big diagonal, we have to keep it as a background. But if we want to do more concrete projects, we have to work at the smaller scale. So when we started to cooperate between Madrid, Zaragoza and Valencia, Barcelona said, what about us? And we said, please, yes, what about you? So there is a way of doing that also, and it was also for us important to see how, when you try to develop this kind of complementary, polycentric structure, how can you also incorporate smaller cities on the spaces in between? And I will show you another example from France, which I find very interesting to deal with this. So you can have, of course, other connections that concerns you. So those are the 10 projects of the EU, north-south, Adriatic to the Baltic. So there we are, you can find Gdańsk. So these were these things are still in the pipeline, maybe not very fast, but they are there as concepts to get better connections from the north-south, not just east-west. And then more in detail, of course, I don't have to tell the grandmother how to suck eggs, so I will go very quickly, but just to put it into context, that you have, of course, connections and already centralities all around the Baltic. The left-hand side is a map from Espon about higher education and the kind, which is for the knowledge base and what sort of cooperation could happen there. And on the right-hand side, you have the settlement structure, which already has got a lot of connections right throughout the Baltic realm, historic and otherwise, which includes St. Petersburg, by the way. So just because I had to address the issue of theory, so I will race through that quickly. So we have mentioned already Catherine Payne, but she was working with Peter Hall on this book of Polycentric Metropolis, and as you can see from the geography, they were working in the Pentagon, but they were doing some more theoretical work of how actually these cross-cooperations could work and what sort of functional dimensions you should incorporate, not just transportation, not just the connections, but also the nodes. And on the right-hand side, we have got the southeast of the UK, of England, and somebody who was called Nick Green, he has studied what could be the polycentric network there, actually. So, and here are just a kind of few centrality studies done, academic type of studies on what do we mean by polycentricity, and Girl and et al. Have done quite a few. They are inspired by, from mathematical models and from biology and cellular kind of analysis and stuff like that. I feel the analogies are all okay, fine, even the Swiss cheese, but it has its limitations. So you have to be very careful not to then be seduced by the analogy and forget what's behind it. So they applied it on the right-hand side to the region, the city region of London, in fact. And so, of course, you had to establish some kind of criteria of what is polycentricity, what are connections, what are the real links, and what are the false links, and what are the links which you need to strengthen. And we had a conference of urban and regional research, which was hosted by the UN Economic Commission for Europe and the European Council of Ministers, which is the 44 European countries of Ministers of Planning. And so we cooperated with them and had our conference on polycentricity, and that was very interesting because it included a very wide realm, including the Caucasus. So you know, this looked very different from their point of view and from our point of view, although they wanted to see themselves in the European realm, which I found also very interesting. You don't know how far it goes. De Gaulle said the Ural, maybe, we don't know. It's open there. On the west we have the sea. So. But anyway, in the middle you have the kind of typical, it's just one example of the criterion of the rank order of cities. So of course you can define it in very many different ways, but I personally I find it's all right to have that as one dimension, but not the dimension. Because what does it mean for a city to say I'm now number 2, number 1, in relation to what? Just one particular criterion with one particular sets of variables which are added there, usually based on surveys of opinions, not on statistics, not on facts. So it has to be, again, it's a tool, it's useful, but you have to be always very critical towards these tools. So this is just an example of where the cities stand in this rank order in the European cities. And on the right-hand side, you have the kind of criteria which have been proposed at our conference, and it was the sort of orthodoxy of polycentricity. Now, it's not a new idea. And here what I want to show is that some of it is planned, some of it is market-led, and some of it is conceptual and so forth. So the planned one, very famous plan from Abercrombie, which he did, by the way, during the Second World War, which is quite heroic when you think about it. He really saw the bigger picture for London. Because, of course, before the war, London was more than 8 million population and growing. And during the war, of course, it was bombarded, but there were also a lot of people being displaced and taken out of the city. So, in fact, it has never, this problem of congestion, so it was actually no longer there after the war. But they continued on this momentum to say we have to decentralize this very, very concentrated node, which had a big head of the country and big head of the region, and create a green belt and create the new towns around it, which should be self-sufficient in themselves, with workplaces, I mean, so multifunctional, mixed use, as we would call it nowadays. So not the kind of Corbusian modernism with huge segregation, but to incorporate them all. But it is very traditional plans. Now, the plan on the right is just one example of Euclid, of how you conceptualize things in a much more fuzzy way, which has been mentioned before as well. The rigid administrative boundaries sometimes are not so helpful, even if you have a mayor who actually sits on that boundary. So he can be tempted to say, I'm only working for my patch and not the one next door. It doesn't have to be, but it can. So here, the market-driven metropolis, of course, this is much, much stronger than anything we can plan. So I think the planners shouldn't delude themselves. They are just one dimension of contributing ideas and maybe some kind of analytical studies and evaluation. But there is a dynamic in the spatial world, which is represented here by the studies which are done by ESPON, by the Urban Observatory. Just, for example, the location of international headquarters, or the location of the highest value service companies and so on, IT penetration and so forth. For example, the business strips on the top map. So you can see the dynamic of the market, which is just happening anyway. So again, I don't think you can go against that. I think you have to be very aware of that and see what its dysfunctionalities are. And of course, you may notice from what I'm saying that I'm not necessarily agreeing with my predecessor speaker who thinks that the market can just solve it all. We know that it can't. We have in London very good examples of that, including these planning disasters. So here is a methodology of managed polycentric development, which comes from France, and it's called SCOT, and that stands for Schéma de Cohérence Territoriale, which is, for me, an extremely interesting tool, because France is very centralized, as Poland used to be, very top-down, and everything, the regulations and planning, they all come like in this pyramid. So, although they created directly elected regions, but the final say is still in central government, just like in the UK. But they have created this informal tool, which enabled local authorities, cities of different scale, at different level, or even regions, to participate with each other for a certain particular territorial purpose. Now here we have got the Loire Valley, which goes from Nantes to Saint-Nazaire, on the northwest of France. And they had a huge problem because the Loire was dividing the area rather than reuniting it. And of course it's very wide, and it had shipping, and Saint-Nazaire was a naval base, still is actually. So of course there were a lot of uses of the river which were divisive rather than uniting, so they started to build bridges and say, well, but can we establish other kind of links across the river, cooperation, use the river as a positive, uniting element, to use it for navigation, for ferries, whatever, rather than to have this divisive element within. And I think that is a very interesting one, an early one, which was started with various people, and so they created all sorts of formal or informal structures of cooperation, some on transportation infrastructure, some on navigation, some on fishing and so forth. I mean, it's extremely interesting, I feel, and of course you can read it up on the internet, everything is on the internet. And here are the kind of spatial connections which they tried to establish. So you have got the city of Nantes, which of course is the sort of spider in the web, but they have made quite sure that a lot of small municipalities could participate and benefit from this cooperation, even rural ones. So it's very, very, very widely disparate and so on. And of course you have similar problems as in Gdańsk, in Saint-Nazaire, because although it's still a naval base, it is no longer that important. So there is a lot of derelict land, a lot of brown land, just like the factory on the bottom and so forth, very polluted and all this sort of stuff. So how do you actually, what do you do with this city and so on in the post-industrial era, but building on its past, on its history, as Bilbao did very successfully. Not just with the Guggenheim Museum, much, much more. Because they continue, and for the last 30 years, they have step by step, they have built and transformed themselves, but they have taken the population on board, and they have done it not just in one place where you attract the tourists, but throughout the city and in cooperation with other cities in the region, which I find is really very interesting. So again, here you have, in the UK, I come to my patch now, you had really a principle, sort of post-Second World War consensus, which of course is rooted even post-First War, or even pre-First War. In 1909 we had the first planning laws and so on. But the consensus was that you sought a balance between the public interest and private property and private rights and private interests, which are very much based on property in the UK. And in a way, the plan of Abercrombie, which I come back to on the right-hand side, with the green belt and the new towns and so on, that was very much this kind of balance, because it was based on a social market. It wasn't based on a wild liberal market. But now, the presumption, we have new planning law, we have a bombardment of planning laws. I mean, we had the 1947 Planning Act, which has been in operation the whole century. Then comes change with Mr. Blair, and said, no, we have to do something modern. And so we have had one part of planning law after the other, the latest in 2012 and one in 2011. We have a national planning policy framework, It's just gone on stream. Then we have a localism bill, and then we have a bill which is really dealing with property rights. And what it says, in essence, is there is a presumption of sustainable is of course questionable development, which is the new neoliberal compact. So, in other words, unless you have a very good reason for it not to happen, you let it happen and you facilitate it. So the results are just two at the moment under construction in London. One is Broadgate, and the other one is the Shard, which is going to be the highest tower in Europe until the next one comes along, somewhere else, I hope. And so I just mentioned these three pieces of legislation. So the Localism Act, which the idea being that you give more power to the people and they can design their own neighborhood plans, but of course it's going to be very divisive because it's going to be the NIMBYs are going to do that, and the others don't even know what the plan means. And the only time you get an interest is when you're getting addressed, like for example being pushed out of your homes and out of your businesses when London is hosting the Olympic Games. So, but otherwise it doesn't mean anything to people, and especially regional planning means nothing. So there is a real, you have to not forget that, because the regional planning strategies do matter, they have impacts at the very local level. But to convey that, to actually be able to communicate what that actually means for people on the ground, this is also part of planning, this is also our task, and I think this is a very difficult nut to crack, but we certainly should have a go at it. And you have the middle level, as you mentioned. We have, in fact, still a sort of metropolitan government, which is the Greater London Authority with an elected mayor. We had the Greater London Council beforehand, which was abolished. But what was maintained quietly as a concession, political concession, was an advisory planning committee which was continuing to monitor and to collect data and to analyze with an extremely competent professional and scientific team. And so of course the new authority inherited the lock, stock and barrel, plus the archives, plus everything. So they're very, very competent and very, very good. So I feel that it's extremely important that you have an arm's length urban observatory where you get the information, and I don't mean opinion polls only, I mean really data. You go and you measure and you count and you show what's going on and show what the actual dynamic of the city is, whether you plan it or not, whether you control it or not. And I think this knowledge base is very important. And there again, I think you have to cooperate between academia, between consultancies and experts and so on from different functional fields. But this is essential for me for a successful city. And we have it now in London. You have it in other cities like Helsinki, for example, has a fantastic database, totally publicly available, interactive and all that. This is also interactive. It's very, very good. It's a very fine grain. So it means money, it means investment, but I think with that you make far less awful mistakes. So just to show again where London is situated in the southeast region. So of course we changed from the post-industrial society to the knowledge society. So where is the knowledge? Of course in Cambridge and in Oxford for us, and these are, Oxford is on top, Cambridge is on top, Oxford on the west, and London in the bottom. And as you can see, there are quite big distances between them, but of course the networking and the links are extremely strong. And there is a big synergy going on between not just universities, but also companies who come and settle there, who develop new products and so forth, and services in particular. Now, they have the Metropolitan Southeast. We never had, certainly not elected regions in England, and you have to distinguish between England, Scotland, which is now a bit evolved, and Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. So I'm talking about England now, and London, which is the capital of the whole of the UK, but of course also very important for England. And so there was a cooperation between these, what were called the economic development agencies. They were a sort of, we call them Quango, and they are quasi-governmental organizations, so they are part, but at arm's length of the public sector. And so there was some kind of cooperation between them, and some kind of way of seeing which are the growth poles, which are the dynamics, where should we invest, because you can't invest everywhere and at the same time. But these have now all been abolished. with a national policy framework out. So we don't have any regions, which I think is impoverishing our tools, certainly. So I think even if they are not duly elected regions or metropolitan governments with an elected mayor, these kind of quangos are still very useful, and maybe that might be a model for this region to get the forces together, because they included businesses in particular. They had a very strong voice there, and the intelligentsia and all that sort of thing, and then the various ethnic groups and all that. So, and this is just quickly the key diagram which was in the mayor's plan. Now it's the London plan, the mayor's London plan. That was the one of Livingstone. And again, you can see that although the boundary, which you can see is hard, which has been inherited actually from the Great London Council, because it was too complicated to think what the actual, area would, physical, spatial area would consist of. It doesn't correspond to that at all, but they just kept it. But then they were looking in their plan to see, well, what are in fact the potential growth areas, which you have to, again, concentrate rather than just have a bit of growth everywhere. And in fact, interesting enough, so that was a left-wing guy, and what happened here? I don't know what this is. So that was the other diagram, which has disappeared. But what I wanted to show is it's very, very similar to this one. Got it some surprise. I'm sorry for that. So just here is the first one, and here's the second one. The same growth patterns, basically, because they make sense. So where does that sit in the actual, in the more regional dimension? And you have the Thames Valley, which goes from Oxford right down to the estuary. And of course, the city development has taken place for the last 50, 60 years, right beyond the green belt. And so on the west, which is always usually the wealthy part of cities, I don't know why, but it's very, very general. But there you had also the IT development, the knowledge base and so forth. In the east, that was the provision for London, dustbin, the waste disposal, the electricity generating, all this sort of thing. Well, you have to have it somewhere for a big city of 8 million. So how do you rebalance this spatial dimension? So they have tried to do a lot of, so the West was developing in the 70s, and now they have tried to really start to develop the East, especially with the Olympic Games. So that was a big impetus with 9.6 billion pounds. I don't know how much is that in Zloty, but it's an awful lot of money. So you could really do something with that. And so, as you can see, but they have said, well, they have different characteristics, those areas. And so how can we actually make sure that this development is not just a one-off or short-lived, but it really continues? What's that? Right. So we have, because of course the port of London has been moved out of London a long time ago. It's a tidal river, so not convenient. We need, the technology has changed, so we have container ports. You have, just like in Gdańsk, same thing. And so you have a big port right on the sea, and at the end of the estuary, in the deep sea, and so forth. And now the idea is to put a new airport hub in that same area and to combine it with a new big port, which is being developed very, very, very intensely at the moment, with a barrier because of climate change. We are starting to flood more and more. And you can see on the left-hand side the connection with that. So we have built quite a bit of, benefited, took advantage of the Olympic Games to actually build large-scale infrastructure like the Crossrail, like the high-speed train, like all these kind of very large infrastructure investments we have actually managed to do. Now, but the growth pressure is still to the west, so I'm skipping that. But one of the reasons is because there is quite some land available. Some land is being vacated by big departures, like the BBC, for example, which has been moved to Salford. So suddenly you have got very valuable land in central London, West London. So of course that is where people, the developers, the market wants to go and will go. So how can you attract it to the other side? And I think my last picture is really to say, well, for me, whatever you do, you have to think, how can you reconcile competition, cooperation, coordination, and complementarity? And I would add, while I'm here, solidarity, because I think that is a very strong, cohesive motivation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for being patient.
Thank you very much, Judith, for this, and please take a seat here on this. And I would also like to invite all our speakers to take Judith, please. Okay. Sophia and Professor Markowski, Professor